Hey everyone, I'm Cody Seibert and welcome to part 2 of building a full stack web application using Vue.js and Express.js. So if you remember on the last part 1 we built a register page which hits a /register endpoint on the server. So in this part 2, one of the things we're going to do is actually connect to a database or have our API connect to a database, and in this case we're going to be using Sequelize, which is an ORM to connect to like SQL related databases such as like MySQL or Postgres or SQLite. A couple people asked if we could do MongoDB, but I feel like SQL databases are still one of the most popular ones, so I think it's more important to learn how to use SQL versus MongoDB. And also I think the data that we're working with is relational, which is another reason why I think we should be using Sequelize to connect to a database to store these relational models. Alright, so before I get started with bringing in Sequelize, let's go ahead and just look at it really quick. So inside the Sequelize project, they have these docs defined. These docs are pretty good. They're not the best, but if you read through these, you can get a good understanding of how you use Sequelize, how you define models, how you can use models. But basically, to sum it up, Sequelize provides you with data models, where each model maps to a table in a database. So for instance, if you wanted to create a user model that has an email and a password, you can just create a Sequelize model and then it'll automatically connect to whatever SQL database such as SQLite. It'll create your tables and then create your columns for that table. And then you can use objects inside your Node or Express server to kind of manipulate that data or add records, remove records, etc. And that's kind of all I'm going to cover with the Sequelize documentation. So let's just go ahead and get started using Sequelize. So to start off, we want to first install those dependencies. So on the right, I'm going to say npm install save Sequelize, and then we also want to include SQLite 3, and I'm going to do version 1.3.8, just because I ran into an issue in the past with a newer version of SQLite 3. So anyway, when that stuff is done installing, it shouldn't take too long. What we can do in the meantime is we need to first kind of get our project set up to start using that Sequelize package. So to start off, we're going to go ahead and pretend like we have a file called models, which is going to export a Sequelize object. So if I do const Sequelize equals require ./models, if I can spell that correctly. So basically we're assuming that there's a models folder which has an index.js file which returns an object that has a Sequelize attribute on here. And what we want to do is just go ahead and do Sequelize.sync, which will basically connect Sequelize to whatever database that you have it configured for, and then create the tables if they don't exist, and just get everything set up and ready to go. And once you're done syncing Sequelize to your database, we're going to go ahead and just start our server. And to kind of make this more useful, when the server starts, just go ahead and print out a message so we can actually know when it started. So I'll say console log server started on port, and I'll say config port. And then here I'm going to refactor this a little bit and just say config port. And you'll notice that we don't have anything called config defined in this file. So up here I'm going to say const config is equal to require /config/config. So the first thing I need to do is create a new folder called config, and I'll create a file inside that folder called config.js. And inside this config.js I want to export something that says port 8081. So now app.js can include that file and then kind of use whatever's defined in that config to spin up the application. Another refactoring I'm going to do before I actually start working more into Sequelize and defining the models is, if you notice here we have the routes defined. It's kind of useful if you have a separate file where all your routes are defined. So what I'm going to do is, in the source folder, I'm going to make a new file called routes.js, and that's going to export a function. And basically what we're going to do is cut that code out and put it inside that routes.js module, save that file, and then here what we can do is just go ahead and require that file. So I can say const, actually I could just say require routes, and then I'm going to pass it app. Because if you remember, our routes file basically just returns a function for us where we can pass an app, and it's going to just go ahead and attach all the different endpoints onto that application or that Express application variable. Alright, so by this point, Sequelize and SQLite 3 should be done installing, which it is. So I'm going to go ahead and just close out of that tab. And then additionally, we're seeing an error print out because the routes file does not have a new line at the end of the file. So I'm just going to fix that really quick. Do the same thing with config. Okay, so it says right now cannot find module models because we haven't even declared that yet. So that leads us to the next step of part 2, which I'm going to start building up a user Sequelize model. So to start off, let's just go ahead and make a folder called models. And inside here, I'm going to make a new file called user.js, which is going to be my user model. So the first thing you need to do is, if you read through the Sequelize documentation, you can kind of figure out how you define Sequelize models. And we're going to do a little bit of custom logic and linking for our models so that we can kind of easily put new models into this model folder and not have to worry about importing it somewhere else. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say user.js is a file which exports a function which takes Sequelize and data types. And then what this is going to do is we're going to use Sequelize to define, so you do Sequelize.define a new model. So the first argument is the name of your model, which is going to be user. And it's going to be used for storing user-related information. So first one, we want to, so the second argument here, this is the options or attributes that are attached to your table or model. So the first attribute we want is email, because you sign up with your email and password. So say that's going to be called email, and the type is going to be a string. And then we're also going to say that this is required to be unique because we don't want multiple users signing up with the same email account. And then the second attribute we're going to say is going to be called password, and it's also going to be a string. So at this point, again, user.js is a function which takes Sequelize and takes data types, and then it's going to return or define a user model which we can use. So now the next step is, if you remember in the app.js, we included /models. So we need to create a index.js file. And inside this index.js file, we want to do a couple of things. First, we're going to declare a DB object, which we're going to export later on. But more importantly, we first want to include a FS module, which is the Node.js way of reading through the file system. We're going to include the path module, which is used for kind of dealing with, absolute paths, relatives paths, or whatever. So we're going to use that in conjunction with FS. We're going to include the Sequelize model, because we're going to need that to actually create a Sequelize object and connect it to a database. We're going to include that config file that we created earlier. And okay, so at this point, the first step we're going to do is we're going to declare a Sequelize object. So we can say const Sequelize is equal to new Sequelize. And that's going to take in a couple of arguments. So the first argument is going to be the database that we're connecting to. So let's just assume in config we have something called db.database. And we can also assume that we have something called user, we have something called password, and then lastly we have additional options that we can pass to Sequelize. So at this point what we can do is we can go into that config file, and I'm going to go ahead and declare a DB attribute which is going to have that database. It's going to have user. It's going to have password. It's going to have options. So for database, we're going to load in a couple of environment variables and fall back to tab tracker. So this is the name of the database that we're going to use. So typically if you have like MySQL or Postgres, you create a database. So your Postgres instance is going to have like 100 different databases inside of it, and each database has a unique name. So we're say database is equal to this environment variable db name or tab tracker. And we're going to use this later on when we like deploy to a real environment. But it's good just to have this here in the meantime. And if it's not defined, we're going to fall back using the or to tab tracker. And then the same thing with user. We'll say db user. Password process env db pass. And that's also just going to be tab tracker for local. And then finally, when we get to options, there's three things we need to define. So first is dialect. And that's a useful option in Sequelize to tell it what type of database you're going to be connecting to. So obviously we want to set that to SQLite when we're local. We have host, and that's used for telling Sequelize the location of the database that you want to connect to. So in this case, we'll say localhost is the default. And then lastly, we want to put storage for SQLite, and that pretty much tells you where to store your SQLite file. So I'll say tab tracker SQLite. Cool, so at this point we have, again, a config file that declares the port. In fact, I'm going to do process env port or 8081 so we can overwrite that as needed. And then we have an attribute called db, which has all the different Sequelize related configuration we need. So if I go back to models folder and then index.js, you can see how this makes sense, that we're just grabbing that config and passing it to the Sequelize constructor here. So now the next part is we want to just go ahead and write some short functionality to just automatically read through all of the models in this models folder and set it up to be used with Sequelize. So I'm going to go ahead and do fs.read sync and then pass it dir name. So basically this is going to read through the current directory and give us an array of different files, and then I'm going to filter out any file that is equivalent to index.js. So we don't want this index file, but we want every other model file. And then after we do that filter, we can just say for each file that we found, we want to go ahead and declare a model. And basically Sequelize has a import method where you can give it a full path to a file, and it will go ahead and just import that and set it up to be used with Sequelize. So I'll go ahead and use path.join to join the dir name to the file, and then tell Sequelize to import it. And then finally we can say set the db.name of the model, so in this case it would be db.user is equal to model. And then lastly, we can just go ahead and declare a couple of useful variables onto this db object. So I'm going to declare db Sequelize and capital Sequelize, so that when we use this in our code, we have access to the Sequelize object, we have access to the capital Sequelize object, and then we have access to the actual models. Alrighty, so at this point, let's go ahead and make sure that we don't have any linting issues. Okay, so we saw that the server restarted itself when I saved some of the files, and then it executed this SQL command, and it said create table if not exist users, and then it gave that table a couple of columns such as email and password, and that's about it. So basically Sequelize will create your table if it doesn't exist and give it the columns that you've defined in your model. And that was pretty easy to do. Like a lot of this stuff, like this, we didn't even need to do. but it's more of a helper function that allows us to easily add more models down the road without having to, like, for each one, require it, import it, and set it up in Sequelize. Okay, so again, as a recap, we installed Sequelize. So if you look at package.json, we installed Sequelize and SQLite 3. Sequelize is an ORM used to connecting to SQL databases, and SQLite 3 is a local instance of a SQL database without having to go through all the extra work of setting it up and whatnot. And then once we installed those, we went ahead and created this models folder, which has a Sequelize model, which we're going to be using for our user accounts, which has an email and has a password. And then we have this index file, which is basically used for connecting to our database, which is going to load in a couple of configurations, which is defining our config right here. And then it's going to go ahead and read all the files that are in this models folder that do not equal index.js, and it's going to go ahead and load them into Sequelize. And then we just go ahead and return that, which we can use later on. So at this point, we can actually start modifying our route to use this Sequelize stuff. So another thing I'm going to do, let me just close out of all these tabs. So we're requiring routes here. So if I open up the routes file, I think we're done with app.js for a while. Something that is useful, and you'll see this in a lot of frameworks, is you're going to have a folder called controllers. And a controller is basically where you have all of your endpoints defined. So inside controllers, I'm going to go ahead and create an Authentication Controller.js file. And inside this file, we can go ahead and just export our model, or export whatever routes should be associated with authentication. So in this case, we obviously want to have a register route, right? So if I were to do this and just put that same function, let me just get rid of this stuff. So basically I took the same function that was defined in routes and I put it in register, but we're only caring about the callback function right here, which is the express endpoint or middleware or whatnot. And then what we want to do is in routes, we can up here just go ahead and include that. So we can say const authentication controller is equal to require controllers authentication controller. So then whenever we hit this register endpoint, we can just say authentication controller dot register. So this is a nice way to kind of simplify and keep everything isolated. So your controllers, again, are used for declaring all your endpoints, and then your routes are for declaring your routes that point to your controllers. So again, just to make sure this works, let's go ahead and hit that register endpoint and make sure it returns that message. And it does, everything's still working as expected. So now we can actually start implementing some logic to kind of create a user model and save it to our database when someone hits this register endpoint. Okay, so if we take a step back and just talk about what we're trying to do, or if you remember from the front end, the user is going to pass us an email and a password in the payload of the JSON. All right, so on rec.body, we should have an email and a password, and we already demonstrate that we have email here because we're returning that message. So what we are trying to do is we want to create a new user record and store it into our database whenever someone hits this endpoint. So first of all, let's go ahead and insert, or not insert, but let's import or require that user model that we declared. So we can say const user equals require dot dot model, or actually this would be models, because we're going to include that index file.js, which had all of the models declared as attributes on this object. So now we can actually use that user object here that we defined inside of our callback. So what we can do here at this point is we can say const user is equal to await user.create rec.body. And I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this stuff for now. And of course, I'm going to use async instead of promises because it just makes everything cleaner. So basically, we want to create a user using the body that was passed in on the request. And that will create us a new user. And if for some reason there's any error, such as, user or email already exists, we're going to catch it inside this try catch statement. So if we get an error, we can say res.status is a 400 error, and then go ahead and send some type of error message. So in this case, I'll say this email account is already in use. And you've seen that in front ends where you try to sign up for the same website with the same email account, and it'll tell you this email account is already in use. So this will be returned to the user if this fails to run for some reason. And then if it is successful, we can just go ahead and send back that information. So I'll just go ahead and say res.send user.toJSON to basically send back that user object to the client who has requested this endpoint. So go ahead and save this file. Make sure that there's not any linting issues or crashing the server. Seems like everything is fine. And what we can do at this point is if I go to register and I go and try to pass it testing@gmail.com, it should return a 200 status with that user object that was created. Right, so now this is actually inside the SQLite database. We actually have a user. So if I were to try to do this again, we should get that catch error back that says this email account is already in use. All right, so that's pretty cool. I mean, we have a server running that's connected to a database using Sequelize. We're able to store information inside the database. At this point, we can't really grab it yet from any endpoints, but we've demonstrated that, yes, the data has been changing because now we get this error account or error message back when we try to create an account with the exact same email. And again, the reason why that constraint is failing is because in the model, we added line 5, which is unique true, saying that the email has to be unique, so it can't already exist inside that record. Okay, so at this point, you may say, okay, well, if I were to try to pass in a bogus email account, so like 123, to this endpoint, it's still going to work. It's still going to try to create an account with that email. So another useful thing to do to have on your backend is validation. So what we're going to do at this point is let's go ahead and make or include another framework called Joy. So I'll do npm install save Joy. And Joy is a framework used for validating the request.body, the request.query, or the request.parameters. And so as an example of how you set that up, typically in these bigger frameworks, you're going to have like another folder called like policies. So I'm going to go ahead and create a folder called policies here. And I'm going to go ahead and create an authentication controller policy. And inside this file, we want to kind of create express middleware, which is going to validate that certain requirements or data constraints pass or fail. So to start off, we'll say module.exports, and then we're going to export the name of the exact same method that we've used in our controller, so we'll call it register. And it's going to be a function which takes rec, res, and next. And what we want to do is first we need to include that Joy framework that we just installed, which should be done by this point. Yep, it is, so I'll close that. And then we also want to go ahead and, actually that's all we need to do right there. So again, we included the Joy framework. We created this module which has a register method. And for now I can just say call next. And how do we actually use this, right? So if we go back to routes, we can include this up here and say const authentication controller policy is equal to require, and I'll just say policies. So I'll go ahead and require that in. And then what we want to do is call that policy as a middleware function before we hit our controller. So how this works in Express is we're going to hit this endpoint, and it's going to continue to go down the list and invoke whatever middleware that you have defined. So it's going to hit this controller policy.register file, which is declared here. And then when this method calls next, it's going to go ahead and go to the next line, which is going to be our register endpoint, which again is defined here. So again, this is Express middleware. You can read more about it on their documentation page, and I think it'll make more sense as we continue making more endpoints down the road. So what we want to do inside this middleware function is we need to validate that email and password kind of match a couple of constraints. So the first constraint we need to do is we need to do const schema is equal to an object. And in that object, we're going to have email, and we're also going to have password. And email is going to be required to be a string, and it's also going to be required to be an email format. So Joy has a bunch of different like built-in pre-baked validations, and email is one of them. So we're saying email has to be an email. And then password, we can say make sure it's also a string, and make sure it matches a particular regex expression. So I'm just going to pass a new regex expression. And what we want to do here is pass it character class of A through Z, capital A through Z, or 0 through 9. And then, of course, make sure it's at least 8 to 32 characters long. And then go ahead and put a money sign to end that string. So I think I did that correctly. So basically, again, email has to be an email address, and then password has to be a string which matches this regex expression. And again, if you don't know much about regex, you should probably go read up on regex. But basically, we have these classes which say everything that's passed in has to be the character lowercase a through z, uppercase a through z, or 0 through 9. And it has to be a minimum of 8 characters and a maximum of 32 characters. So after we have this schema defined, we need to actually use it. So we say const error value is equal to joy.validate. And the first parameter you do for validate is you need to pass it the thing you're trying to validate. So in this case, we want to validate the request body, and we want to validate against our schema. So this will return an error if there was an error. So I'll say if error, else we just go to the next. So basically, if there's no error, everything's good, we just go to the register endpoint and register that user. If for some reason there was an error, we need to figure out which validation failed. So I'll say switch error details of 0, context of key. So that gives us the key that failed. In this case, it's going to be either email or password. And then we're going to have a switch case and just check if it was email, we need to do something. If it was password, we got to do something. And then default, do something else. So starting off, if for some reason the email validation failed, we could say res.status of 400, and then go ahead and send an error message saying, let's say like, you must provide a valid email address. Cool. And then for password, similar thing, but we're going to say, this time let's just return a little bit more information. So we'll say, the password provided failed to match the following rules. And then we'll just make this HTML so we can easily format this. I can say it must contain only the following characters, lowercase, uppercase, numerics. And then I'll say rule 2 is it must be at least 8 characters in length and not greater than 32 characters in length. So again, if there is an error, we check if it was an email error, and we can send back, you must provide a valid email address. We check if there's a password error and say, the password has to match these rules. And then otherwise, we can just say, like, I don't know, res.status of 400, send an error saying, like, invalid registration information. So that should make sense. Let's just, again, do a recap. We included the Joy framework, which is used for validating different things in Express. And then we created a module which has a register method, which is an Express middleware, which takes a rec, a res, and a next. And again, rec is the request that comes in, res is what you use to send something back, and next is what you call to invoke the next thing in the routes path. And then we declared a schema, which says emails must have an email structure, passwords must match this regex. We validate the rec.body against the schema here. We check the error, we check the key of the error, and return different error messages depending on what failed. And then if everything was good, we just go ahead and call next. So at this point, I'll go ahead and save that file, and I'll double check to make sure that we don't have issues. So on the routes, we have no trailing spaces. Let me go to the routes file. Cool. All right, so now at this point, let's go ahead and test out that the policy is working as expected. And to do that, we can again go back to Postman, and we can try to pass it bogus data. So we're saying, pass it just testing. It sends back an error. You must provide a valid email address with a 400 bad request response. And so if I were to give it a good email address and try to send, it's going to say the password provided failed to match the following rules. So cool, that's working. If I go to 7 and 8 and send that, it says this email account is already in use. So I'll change that and see what happens. So boom, we were allowed to create a 123@gmail.com with the password 123456778, and it returns us back the exact user that has been created. All right, so now at this point, we have a pretty good setup for registering a user into our database. And we have policies that kind of return errors so that the user knows what exactly is required. We also need to, at some point, hash the password because you're not supposed to be saving, raw passwords into your database. But we can kind of cover that in a second. So let's go ahead and move to the UI again. So if I go back to that register component up here, just a recap, we had an input for email, an input for password, and we had a button to register. Okay, so now that the backend is returning different error codes and messages, we want to kind of display that in our user interface. So what we can do is, if we want to catch the error that's returned, we can go ahead and just wrap this in a try catch. So if for whatever reason authentication service fails to return, or fails to, for whatever, sorry, let me rephrase that. For whatever reason, authentication service, the endpoint returns a status other than like 200 or whatnot, we can catch that error here, and we can go ahead and say this.error is equal to, I'm going to change this to response. Actually, no, I'll say error. So I'll say error.response.data.error. And this is basically what is returned from Axios, and then error is going to be that message that we've defined. And of course, if we're going to try to access this.error, we need to define it in data. Oops. And then lastly, we need to kind of print that out. So up here, if I above the button, I could just do div, and I could say v HTML is equal to error. I can just close that off here. And again, put a break. And I'm also going to say that this is going to be a class of error. So down in the style, I can say error is equal to color of red. So if I were to save this file now, and then try to register with some bogus data, we get you must provide a valid email address, change it to @gmail.com, password you provided failed to match the following rules. It seems like that kind of truncated some of the data. So maybe this isn't like big enough. Let me just double check what's going on here. Because it looks like it's returning. Okay, so in my backend, you see there's I'm missing a caret here. So let me just go back to my backend code really quick, to my authentication controller. Actually, I'll go to my policy, and I'll change that to that. Now if I try to hit the endpoint again, boom. Okay, so we get the actual full error message now. Cool. So again, as a recap, I didn't really explain Vue components before, but basically every .vue file is separated into 3 sections. You have your template, which is used to define your HTML template. And then inside your HTML, you can have special attributes like vModel or vHTML. Technically, anything that has v hyphen is a Vue-specific attribute. And that's used to kind of bind to your script tag down here, which is the second part that every .vue component has. And the script is basically an object that has lots of different methods on it. So data is the data that you can bind 2-way and 1-way to your template. And then methods would be any type of method that you want to be able to access from your template. And there's a couple others which we'll cover in the future, but it's just for now, we can just focus on those 2. And again, the last one is your style section, which is going to be, in this case, scoped. So any styles you declare here will not affect anything else in your Vue application, assuming that you have scoped. So .error will only work for this template. So again, everything in Vue is really like compartmentalized and isolated, so it's really nice. Let's try to think. And again, here's an example. @click means whenever the button fires a click event, call the register method, which is what you saw down here. That's how we're calling register. So just a little bit more information about the Vue component that I don't think I really talked about in part 1. I kind of just started doing stuff without talking, but hopefully by now that kind of makes more sense. All right, so I think the last thing I'm going to do in this part 2 video is I want to kind of bring in a new project inside the front end to allow us to easily style and kind of do layouts. So there's a project called Vuetify, which is a framework that can be used to build like material designs apps. So again, their documentation is pretty good here. On the left, it has like, all the components you can use. So if I wanted to do like a grid list or a form, they give you examples of how you do it. You can go and check out their code here. They give you a template. I think you can see the code somewhere. Maybe not. Let me find a different one. Like data tables. Here we go. So again, they give me an example of a data table. You can go here and view the source code, which gives you the template, and they give you the script here. So again, Vuetify is just a framework that's used for building really nice material design apps. So feel free to check it out, and that's what we're going to be using. So what we want to do to include this in our application is we first want to go over to, again, our terminal and go to our client, and we want to npm install a couple of things. So first of all, we want to include Vuetify. And I think actually that's the only thing we need to include is just Vuetify. Okay, so now that that is done installing, we can just go back to our UI, and we want to include it. So if we go to our main.js file here, up here we can just say import Vuetify from Vuetify. And then we also want to import the style sheet. So I'll say Vuetify dist Vuetify min.css. And then to kind of enable that, we can say view.use Vuetify. Go ahead and save that, and hopefully, assuming I didn't forget anything, that should kind of load in the project. So now we have the Vuetify and the Vuetify CSS ready to go. So let's go ahead and try to style this. There's a couple of, the design I kind of like doing is putting stuff in panels with like a drop shadow. I'm not really a style or a designer, so feel free to critique me or give me feedback. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go to the register.vue file here. And Vuetify gives you the ability to kind of like change up your layout. So they give you something called like V layout, and you can pass it like a column layout. So I'll do V layout, and this is pretty much like Flexbox. So this is a V, like a flex grid or whatever. And then here we can do V flex, which is going to be a flex item. And then you can change it kind of like a Bootstrap, where you can change it depending on the size of the screen. We can say for small screens, we want to offset it 3, and then just make it a width of 6. And then in here we can say, let's make a div. And then the Vuetify CSS gives you a couple of pre-baked CSS, so we can give it an elevation of 2 and a white. That's going to make like a white panel with a little bit of box shadow or drop shadow. Another thing we can get from using Vuetify is a V toolbar. So I'll say V toolbar, I'll pass it a flat and a dense attribute, and I'll give it a class of cyan, and I'll give it an attribute of dark so that it turns the text white. And then inside the toolbar, again, this is all in the Vuetify examples. So if you just want to go and copy and paste from their examples, you can do that too. So let me just make sure I got this all right. Basically, I can copy this code out and put it underneath here. Wrap this in a div in case we need some padding. And then also Vuetify gives you a couple of classes, so I can do like padding left is 4, padding right 4, padding top 2, padding bottom of 2. So make sure all these line up. I'm kind of running out of energy, so I might wrap this up pretty soon. So hopefully if I save this, it should be a styled panel with register, and then we have our email account, and we have our password here, and then we have a register button. In the button, we can actually change from button to, I think, V button. So if I were to do V BTN, give it a class of cyan, should change this to a register button. So that's, I think, good enough for right now. We can come back and make this a lot nicer looking, but I'm kind of running out of energy, so stay tuned for part 3. And again, as a recap, we included the Vuetify project, which again, you can find the docs here at vuetifyjs.com. They have a bunch of different components and styles that are pre-baked. It's a really awesome library, so check it out. And then we use Vuetify to kind of style this register panel. And I think part 3, we can just try to fix up the styling and do more by adding like a header or side nav or something like that. All right, thanks for watching, and stay tuned for part 3. It should be coming in a couple of days, hopefully. Thanks for watching.